Thank you for choosing to listen to On Air with Chai and supporting our cause. Being a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support from our community to help keep our programs running and allow us to continually service our families while offering incredible experiences, such as family vacations after treatments, trips to Edmonton Mall, home-cooked meals, big sibling programs, day camp and sleepover camp, and many, many more. If you enjoy our stories and you're thinking of making a charitable donation, think of Chai Lifeline Canada and the children you would be supporting. You can visit us at chailifelinecanada.org.
Canada looking at the genetic causes of childhood cancer, specifically being able to sequence the genetic code in the cancer of now currently all children with high-risk cancer, and ultimately we hope all children with cancer.
Welcome to On Air with Chai, a podcast that inspires, brings hope, shows resilience, and strength. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of On Air with Chai. On today's episode, we have the privilege of speaking with the head of pediatric oncology and hematology at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, Dr. Jim Whitlock. In this conversation today, we cover an array of topics and what is an extremely open, honest, and insightful conversation. I hope you get out of it as much as we did. Enjoy. Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of On Air with Chai. I'm Bryan Strasberg, and as always, joined by my trusty helper, executive producer, executive director of Chai Lifeline Canada, Rothman.
Hello.
And today we are joined by Dr. Whitlock of Sick Kids Hospital. Dr. Whitlock's research interests include the biology and treatment of childhood acute leukemias, the development of new drugs for the treatment of childhood cancers, and the biology of and treatment of histiocytic disorders. He was the inaugural vice chair for new agents in relapse studies for the Acute Lymphoblastic Leukemia Committee of Children's Oncology Group. He is the lead investigator for an international phase 1 trial of Nelibin combination therapy for relapsed T-cell ALL through the Therapeutic Advances in Childhood Leukemia Consortium, and served 2 terms as the first chair of TACL's Steering and Prioritization Committee. He's a past president of the Histiocyte Society, an international scientific organization which supports research in and conducts clinical trials for histiocytic disorders. He's the current chair of C17, which is a national organization for Canadian childhood cancer and blood disorder centers. Welcome.
Wow, that's a lot.
That is a lot. You guys have resumes like...
Well, so the truth is, I'm really a hillbilly from East Tennessee that was fortunate enough to have parents who really believed in an education. And I was fortunate to be the first generation of my family to go to university, ended up going to medical school, ended up in academic medicine, ended up being inspired by a wonderful man named John Lukens, who was a pediatric oncologist during my training. That led to me entering this field. About 12 years ago, I decided to come to Canada, and it's been a phenomenal experience being at one of the great children's hospitals of the world and being able to work with colleagues and families and advocates across the country to try and help these incredible children who face life-threatening illnesses, and how we're making so much progress now on all fronts.
That's amazing. So can we start at the very beginning of how this all happened? I mean, from Tennessee to Toronto, how does that happen?
Well, so I went to medical school in Tennessee at Vanderbilt University, decided to stay there and complete my training with a pediatrics residency. Met and was inspired by John Lukens, who was my primary mentor, and wanted to stay and train with him. And then was fortunate in joining the faculty to be able to actually work with him as a pediatric hematologist oncologist.
What was it
and
about?
Then was even
sorry, what was it about him that made you that drew you to him?
I think he was the kindest and gentlest and most committed man that I had ever met. I consider him in many ways, from an academic and professional perspective, my career father. He was just such a wonderful role model. He was calm and collected and inspiring. He worked so hard, incredible hours, and it just was so wonderful to his patients, so reassuring, so full of hope. I learned so much from him. It was such a privilege and an honor to be able to have worked with him and then for him as a faculty member in his program, and then ultimately when he decided to retire, to be able to take over in his role. That was my dream job for many years. And then after I'd been at Vanderbilt for really all of my career, I began to wonder, is this the only place I'm ever going to work? I had friends who worked here that I'd met through some of those international organizations that you were so kind to mention earlier. And one of them said, Jim, we're going to be looking for a new leader for the HEMONC program. I think you might be a good fit. And so I came up and interviewed, and I knew within 15 minutes of walking through the front doors of the Sick Kids into that incredible atrium and meeting some people that this was a place that I would be proud to be a part of. And it fortunately worked out that way. And here I am 12 and a half years later.
What brought you into childhood cancers? Well,
that's a great question. I think part of it was that so many people, especially when I started my career compared to now, were almost afraid of these children. These were children. I mean, if you have cancer, before we had effective therapies, most children with cancer were going to die of their disease, and people were afraid to work with them. I remember one of the stories that John Lukens told me that inspired me so much. When he first was training, and this was in an era in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he and his colleagues were accused of being unethical because they were developing new treatments for children with acute lymphocytic leukemia, the most common of childhood cancers, and a disease that at that time was uniformly fatal. And there were physicians in the medical community who felt that it was unethical to treat these children because you would just prolong their suffering. And if it weren't for pioneers like John Lukens and others like him, we might not be where we are today. But they pushed forward, and the reality is now that almost 90% of children with this most common cancer, ALL, at least the standard form of it, can now be cured. And so, and we have reason to think that there may be a day when we can cure every child with acute lymphocytic leukemia and other types of cancer. So in just a generation or two, we've gone from 0 to 85 to 90%. That's stunning, and that's something that I think our society as a whole, at least in the first world, should be very proud of. That children here now can have a tremendous. Most children can have a successful outcome. We still have a lot of work to do for that last 15% of children who are not able to get a cure. And we have to remember that these children all pay a terrible price with the treatments that we've used over the last 50 or 60 years to achieve those cures. But things are changing for the better in a remarkable way. And I have every reason to believe that someday all children will have a cure, and the price won't be as drastic as what they have to pay now.
Well, I do have numbers on that because it is very interesting that you bring that up, because I just jumped onto Canada.ca website, wanted some statistics on children's cancers in Canada. It was saying around 1,000 kids a year in Canada end up with cancer. 311 cases of them are leukemia. Mm-hmm. Is there a reason for that? Is there a specific reason that cancer is triggering kids the most?
I think, yes, we're beginning to understand that. It's a bit medicalese, but if you want to talk about that, I'm happy to do it. I think it's basically related to the fact that our immune systems develop over a number of years, and the acute lymphocytic leukemia, the most common type of cancer in children, representing the bulk of the numbers that you just mentioned, arises in lymphocytes, which are a part of our immune system. And the most common peak age for children with ALL is between 4 and 6 years of age. And that's at a time when the immune system is really robustly developing, with genes that lead to the diversity of our immune system, that help us recognize many different types of infections, are being scrambled in order to create that genetic diversity. And occasionally, this cutting and pasting of genes goes awry. And we think in many instances that that's the trigger for childhood ALL. So it may be that childhood, the cost of us as a species having a robust immune system is that some children, that immune development will go awry when we're young children, and lead to a disease that without treatment is uniformly fatal.
Does that mean that perhaps looking at the parents and their predisposition to certain genetics might be an answer to kind of eradicating this?
Well, I don't think it's an answer to eradicating childhood ALL. There are other ways that prevention may become possible. But you've also touched on another very important point, which is coming out of studies, including a national study here in Canada, looking at the genetic causes of childhood cancer, specifically being able to sequence the genetic code in the cancer of now currently all children with high-risk cancer, and ultimately, we hope, all children with cancer. And what we're finding is a surprising number of known or recognized cancer predisposition syndromes, what you refer to as family cancers, where there may be a germline component that predisposes them to these cancers, and that really wasn't recognized in some childhood cancers. And so this is a rapidly changing field, and you're correct that the best way to ensure success with children's cancer is to figure out how to keep it from ever happening. I think we're not quite there yet, but again, that's a very promising area of research.
You mentioned something a bit earlier with how we're treating the kids, I guess in the earlier days with the cancer treatments. And I found an article that you were in a bit ago. I'm not too sure how long ago it was, but you mentioned that the way we're treating patients now with cancer is by slashing them, burning them, and poisoning them. Essentially, that's shocking, but true. Right.
Yes, slashing is surgery. Right. Burning is radiation therapy. And I think many of my colleagues across the country and around the world would agree that, the traditional forms of chemotherapy are controlled poisoning.
So
medieval.
It's pretty barbaric when you put it in those terms. It absolutely is.
And it works 85% of the time. That's what's so remarkable, that with this, these brutal, archaic approaches, we can cure children 85% of the time in the first world.
But then you continue on saying that when they get into older ages, around 45 years of age, they're going to start having other chronic illnesses that they're going to be dealing with because of these treatments. So I know you're doing research on new medications, new developments, ways of treating these cancers. So how is your research and the way you're looking at these problems going to change the way that they're being treated now?
So that's a great question. And when I talk about this isn't me. This is the royal we. These are people at my hospital, at Sick Kids, across Canada, across North America, collaborators in Europe and Asia and around the world that are making these breakthroughs. And in many cases, there are also researchers that are looking into adult cancers, which share some, but certainly not all features with childhood cancer. And two things that are changing the face of childhood cancer and the way we treat this disease are immunotherapy and precision medicine. Immunotherapy is learning how to harness the power of a patient's own immune system to treat their cancer. We've known for decades that the immune system can recognize some types of cancer, but its ability to react has not been robust enough, if you will, to be able to have much of a clinical impact. And so now, through decades of basic cancer research, we are learning how to harness that immune system and help those immune cells better recognize the cancer cells, which in some cases cloak themselves. If you're a Trekkie and you remember the Klingon cloaking, they can do. That's what cancer cells can do, and we found ways to unmask them so that they can be attacked by the immune system. We also have learned how to help educate or train the immune cells to seek out and find leukemia cells in the bloodstream and attack them in a much more powerful way than they would be able to do themselves. I know that some people don't like the analogy of cancer as a war, but if you see what some of these children go through, I think it's apt. And this is like, being able to, instead of carpet bombing everything, we're able to use smart bombs that will just seek out and attack the cancer cells and spare the normal cells of much of the damage that chemotherapy and radiation therapy have traditionally caused.
I appreciate how straightforward and blunt you are with all this. It's great to hear, especially from the medical side of things. It sounds like you guys are kind of going more towards a homeopathic kind of feel with it, training the patient's own immune system to get them to understand how to fight off these diseases. Is that correct? Or
no, my understanding of homeopathy is using very small doses of traditional medications to treat diseases, and I don't think that's at all what we're doing. What we're doing is really a paradigm shift. Chemotherapies, traditional chemotherapy drugs are primarily poisons, many that come from natural substances that come from bacteria or plants, and some property of them may have been changed, or the amounts that we give may be very different than what occurs in nature. And again, when we find the right recipe and the right schedule to administer those drugs, we can get rid of the bad cells and allow the normal cells to persist, although they may be affected or damaged in some way. So this is really talking about just what I would call a completely different approach. Harnessing the immune system is something that is relatively new. It's leading to, I think, what would have been viewed as miracles as recently as 20 years ago. Patients that we had no effective treatment for, now we can cure a significant number of those patients when all of the traditional treatments have failed. And so this is the approach for any drug development, is to take these new therapies that have not been evaluated previously in adults or children, and to first evaluate them in patients for whom these standard treatments have failed. And if they work, as many of these new treatments are, then we use them to treat earlier in the course. And so I can imagine a day, perhaps in the not too distant future, when all of these poisons and slashing and burning not only are supplemented or assisted in the worst cases with these new approaches, but actually replaced by these new approaches. And that is what's going to allow us to be able to reduce this incidence of close to 60% in adult survivors of childhood cancer having some sort of long-term side effect from the current treatments. That the immune treatments may not cause any long-term permanent damage, and some of these precision medicines that target genetic changes that are present in the cancer cells and only in the cancer cells, and again, in many instances can spare many of the traditional side effects that conventional chemotherapy causes. These are medicines that can change cancer from a life-threatening disease that requires very strong, very radical treatments to a disease that's chronic, and a patient can just wake up in the morning and take a pill And as long as they take their pill, their cancer will remain in remission. And we've got examples of all of these things here at Sick Kids and other hospitals around Canada.
I think it's, there's a lot, so much to unpack from what you just said. And I guess one of the things that struck me is how collaborative Sick Kids is being with what sounds like research around the world. It sounds like it's such a collaborative process that, I mean, you mentioned Asia and Europe and the United States, and it's amazing to me that people around the world are all cued in and included and working together towards this common goal, which I think is something that we don't talk about enough, perhaps.
Well, so necessity is the mother of invention. Childhood cancer, in the big scheme of things, is a relatively rare disease in some ways. And yet in other ways, it's the most common disease-related killer of children in the US and Canada and many other first world countries. And so when my mentor, John Lukens, was working early in his career, the only way that he could succeed is to work with other people who had the same goal in order to collect enough information about these new treatments to really determine if they were working. And so collaboration in pediatric cancer has been essential to our success. It's woven into what we do. One of the reasons that I decided to come to Canada is that Canadians are particularly collaborative. You have to remember. So I'm now a dual citizen. In the U.S., healthcare to some extent is a business, and so hospitals there may have to compete with patients for business. In Canada, it's a right, and I think here there's a much more collaborative atmosphere because we don't have the same expectations about what our hospitals have to achieve in terms of profit. And so we have a network across Canada, several networks actually, research networks and educational networks and advocacy networks. I think a really exciting advance that's been made that was announced just last week by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research and a part of the federal government is a grant, a $23 million grant for all of us across Canada who work in the childhood cancer field to form a Canadian Pediatric Cancer Consortium. This funding was brought about by advocates like Helena's Hope and Acorn and other groups that were able to share their stories with decision makers and for the first time for the federal government to provide funding for research into childhood cancer that would lead to improvements in outcome and would also lead to fewer long-term side effects of the treatment. But importantly, this organization also includes advocates and patients and families who are sitting at the same table with the doctors and the scientists who are doing the research. And that's really a novel approach, and that's why I think this new organization is so important and has the chance to really change the face of how we work together to improve and hopefully eradicate childhood cancer in the coming years. The CPCC, it's available. If you look at the CIHR Facebook page, the announcement is there, their website, and this organization will very shortly be having a pretty robust media presence.
That's incredible. Congratulations for that. I'm sure that's been years and years of your work and a number of people's work to create that and get those funds. I know it was a big deal under the Harper government when Prime Minister Harper gave funding to parents or caretakers of people taking care of people with cancer, and I know that was a big deal as well. So this sounds truly incredible. So that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a dream come true for many of us in the childhood cancer community. But this is an opportunity that we have to seize, and we want to bring together as many members of the Canadian community that are working in various areas and figure out how we can collaborate more effectively, to come back to the point you were making earlier, to help support these children and their families. Not only through the difficult journeys that they face, but how children in some provinces may not have access to some of the treatments that we've just talked about, that can now offer children who previously had no hope, can offer them a realistic chance of a cure. And so one of the things is about providing access to all Canadian children for these marvelous therapies, because the reality is not all of them have.
Well, it does sound like this group is taking a very different approach in terms of including patients and families, and I think that's a breath of fresh air to see researchers kind of look at the humans behind the research, so to speak. Is that a trend that you see happening across the board, or is that particularly with pediatric cancers? And then I'd like to get into some of the conversation that we kind of touched on really before we started the podcast, which was some of the patient advocacy work that's changing at Sick Kids and things of that nature.
So I think that collaboration has happened between patients and families and physicians and researchers at some level for many years. I mean, there are grateful patients and families who fundraise, who give money to Sick Kids and to their other children's hospitals in Canada and the US and other countries who support this. But I think that collaboration has not been as deep or fulsome as it could be and as it really needs to be. And that's what this consortium aims to change. So I think what we've learned is that physicians and scientists can have all of these wonderful discoveries that they're making, but they're very abstract. And you read all of the things that I was involved in, and it sounds great, but what does it mean? It's a snoozer, right? When you hear a patient like Helena Kirk, who is the Helena of Helena's Hope, talk about her journey through cancer, and how many friends she met during her treatment she lost because they were not the regular treatments, the standard treatments, the slashing, burning, and poisoning didn't cure their cancer, and they couldn't get to the other treatments that were becoming available that were admittedly experimental, but they had no opportunity to try that experiment. When you hear her talk about that, you'll begin to understand, I began to understand the power of advocacy, particularly in the childhood community. And I believe every patient and every parent has a story to tell like that. And what we have to do is work with them to be able to better tell their stories, and to understand how those stories can be translated into achieving what they need, which is not just better medical treatments, but better support, fewer long-term side effects, and being able to, get patients who need these promising new treatments, to either take those patients to the treatments, to things like clinical trials, which are treatments that are not yet proven and established as a standard of care, or an even more radical idea that we're really committed to in the CPCC, is to be able to take the trials to the patients. What about children who may live in a northern community and have to travel hundreds of miles to receive a treatment at a cancer center? And if they want to participate in a clinical trial of a new drug, they may have to literally move to a hospital that has that. But, because of COVID, we've learned to do so much in a more remote fashion. Health Canada has recognized this. And so we are working with Canadian regulators and other colleagues to figure out how in a safe and effective way we can begin to change this paradigm of having to bring children to Toronto or to Montreal or to Vancouver to access these new therapies, and at least in some instances allow those children to get high quality care much closer to home, which will reduce the burden on those children, improve their quality of life, reduce the expenses that their families have to endure to come to these major urban areas and get this treatment. So many exciting things to think about going forward.
It's incredible. I think, hearing you speak about the people behind the research, it's actually a major trend, I think, even in the business world, where people are saying, you got to really get to know your customer. You really got to understand who that person is, and what their likes and dislikes are in order to really build your business. So it's incredible for me to hear a researcher such as yourself and a doctor such as yourself really taking the time to understand that. Was that an evolution for you, or was that the way you were trained? Because if it was an evolution, I'd love to understand that. If it was the way you were trained and who you are as a person, I apologize. I just don't. We're meeting for the first time now, so
need more doctors like that.
Certainly.
Well, it's a profoundly insightful question. No, I think I had excellent medical training. All of us at the medical school I went to had to take a class in psychology. That class was very beneficial, how to talk to your patients. And I attended that as a medical student, and I was honored to be invited to actually give one of those lectures when I became a faculty member at Vanderbilt. Having said all that, I am learning to completely change the way I think about how I relate to advocates and to patients and families when we're talking about, health policy and access issues that affect the whole country. And you use the past tense. I'm still evolving in this, but because it's changing how I work every day. I'm used to working in a system where, I'm the head of a program. I make decisions and working with people, and I want to believe I'm collaborative in how we make those decisions together. But I'm having to learn to listen in a new way and to listen to voices that are very different from the voices that I work with here in the hospital every day. Sometimes voices that have been so ignored that they don't really know how to be able to share with people like me what they've been through, what they're facing, what their challenges are. And so that is absolutely a work in progress. And it's been both compelling for me and sometimes frustrating, because the way I'm used to working, to being very efficient and very productive, that doesn't always work when I'm working with people whose voices haven't been heard. In fact, it usually doesn't work. And so I have to slow down, and I have to listen in a different way and work harder to be inclusive. But what I've already learned in the short time that we've been working on the CPCC is that if we're really going to build a community where everyone has a voice, this is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard for people to kind of slow down and give that opportunity to others to kind of share in the way that they need to share. So really kudos to you for noticing that and making sure that that's happening on the level that it seems to be happening. And that's incredible.
Let's be clear. It's not just me. There are a number of people from across the country who are involved in this initiative, both physicians, but also other healthcare providers, researchers, and again, patients and families. One of the unique things about the Canadian Pediatric Cancer Consortium is that, one of the three leaders is the parent of a child who survived cancer because of one of these new drugs, who's, got a different perspective than I do. And I've gained so much in listening to that person, Adrienne, be able to tell us her story, which, in some ways is the same story, but it's not the same story, if you know what I mean.
Do the two sides kind of ever clash? Is there ever a disagreement? And then,
well,
I'm sorry if I'm poking the bear. You can just say next question. We can edit this out.
No. These are great questions, and this is all very real and present and current for me. I think that maybe disagreements. Maybe it's just we need to share more information and listen better to each other. One of the exercises that we're going through with this new collaboration is what should our priorities be? For me, my priorities have always been, because I'm focused on helping develop new drugs, issues related to that. But that may not be the priority of a person who lives in an indigenous community, or it may not be the priority of a patient who finished cancer treatment 10 years ago and has some sort of disability. And we need to listen to each other and be open to what other people's priorities are when they don't align with mine. So yes, I would say there are some disagreements, but I think those are a result of the fact that in some ways we're all still learning new ways to listen to each other.
An amazing thing to hear, because again, I when I think of researchers, I often think of a very cold lab with very distinct, serious people being very, very careful with everything that they're doing, with controls and non-controls and things of that nature. So it's amazing to hear that you guys are moving in that direction. I want to take a moment and kind of switch gears a little bit to what we were discussing a little bit earlier on, really before we started the podcast. And that was in regards to some of the changes that are happening at Sick Kids. I know for a while now, Sick Kids has been very focused on family-centered care, taking a much more holistic approach and understanding that, yes, the patient is sick, but that affects every member of the family, and how can Sick Kids as a hospital address that, as well as, Sick Kids focusing on being a hospital without an address, so to speak, where they're able to provide care to children who, again, don't necessarily live close by to the hospital, but are able to provide supporting care to those types of children. Can you elaborate a little bit about some of the changes that are going on?
Yeah, so I'm not a hospital spokesperson, and some of these initiatives certainly involve the Cancer and Blood Diseases program, but I may not.
So you can speak to that in particular if you'd like.
So one of the things I think is a great example of how we changed our practice to be more family-centered was that through most of my career, when doctors made patient rounds every day, they would go to a conference room and sit down with the other doctors and have a list of the patients and talk about all the patients. And then they would go individually and see the patients. The residents or the fellows, the trainees would have gone early in the morning and seen the patients, and they would come and do the report. And then the faculty, the staff doctors would go and follow up. One of the first changes was that when we began to bring nurses into our rounds to participate in those discussions. And then the next evolution was that the nurses would actually present the patients, because you know what? They're the people who are with the patients like all day, every day, right? They have a better feel for what's going on with these patients in many ways than the doctor who might pop in for 5 minutes.
You're the first doctor I've ever heard say that. Thank you. My wife's a nurse. That's the only reason I say that.
No, but that's really turning things on its head. It's actually incredible that doctors have the humility to they might have all the knowledge, but they have the humility to allow some of the nurses to do that. That's incredible.
Full disclosure, I've been married to a nurse for over 35 years, and listening to nurses is very important.
My mom's a nurse. I get it. So we're all here.
There we go.
but the full development of this was really when we learned how to make family-centered rounds, and my colleague Sarah Alexander here at Sick Kids was really the champion of this in the Pediatric Cancer and Blood Diseases program. And so rather than sitting in a room and looking at a list of patients' names, we would walk around to every patient's room and have that same discussion outside the door with the patient's nurse. And the door could be opened if the family wanted to participate in rounds just to listen in, or to come up and talk about issues they were concerned about.
You give them that option, or they just open the door and listen?
We gave everyone the option to come and be a part of rounds every day. And what this did, I think, was really to improve communication with the patients and families. Because, the nurse would come in and hear something from a patient or a parent. Then the resident or the fellow would come in and hear something and talk about the plan. And then the staff doctor would come in and hear something and talk about the plan. And I think we've all been in a conversation where you can say the same thing and use different words and people hear different things. And sometimes it became like a, situation of broken telephone. And so this family-centered round, having not just a series of presentations, but a true discussion with the patient and the family, if they chose to participate, was, I think, really revolutionary and did so much to improve our patients' understanding of what was happening to them, and what the plan was in a way that didn't happen before. Now, sadly, COVID wrecked a lot of that, and we're still not quite back to that. But I think that's a great example of true family-centered care, is when families are a part of those discussions. And again, we as physicians had to learn how to change our conversations, right? Because the people who were listening to us, our patients and their families, they didn't go to medical school. They don't talk the medical language that I do. But we need to be able to speak to them in a way that allows them to be fully integrated into those conversations. And so I think that's just one of many examples of how family-centered care is really the best care.
To play devil's advocate, though, do you find that it can cause more problems having that family-centered help instead of just the doctors figuring out what's going on their own?
It's a lot of information.
Well, I should point out that this is optional. The patients don't have to attend. The parents don't have to attend. All they have to do is close the door. We actually got little signs made that are sort of red or green, and they would put it, if the parent or the kid didn't feel like talking, then they could just flip it to the red one that, I'm not going to be in rounds today. So it really should be up to them. And some of them don't want to hear this stuff, right? I think there are many adolescents in particular who just want it to all be over, and they sleep through most of their hospitalization when they're getting chemotherapy because it's so boring and there's just nothing good about it, and they just want it to be over as quickly as possible. So, and we've worked hard to address some of those things. Many of the treatments when I came to Sick Kids in 2010 that required multiple days of hospitalization, with the incredible team that we have, we've been able to move those to the day hospital, which is something that we implemented around that time, so that patients could come in and receive a day's worth of hospital treatments, but still be able to go home and sleep in their beds at night, and then come back the next day and get their treatments. I think we would like to be able to take that even further and deliver more of this treatment at home. But we still have a lot of work to do with some of the issues around that to be able to do it safely and effectively.
And we're kind of coming towards the end of our discussion, but perhaps you can share. So, obviously you're pushing as much as you can to have people be back in their own home environment and what's comfortable for them, for their benefit. I would venture to guess because they have a great, they're more comfortable there. Where do you see organizations? Obviously you don't really know Chai Lifeline very well. You just met us, really. But organizations such as Chai Lifeline and Camp Ooch and other organizations, how do you see their benefit in patients, or do you see their benefit in any meaningful way or not? And again, feel free to skip this question if you like, but in actual fact, there's a lot of patient support, social support organizations out there, and as I think kids move more towards the model of trying to be home as much as possible, in my opinion, and there's been a number of doctors that have shared this opinion with me. They see the importance of these community organizations even more. But I'm curious if you've seen anything in the research or anything of that nature.
Well, I have a personal experience with that. When I was at Vanderbilt, I knew that there was a summer camp for cancer patients there as well, and I had a number of patients go. And occasionally, I would drive out one evening to go to some of the campfire activities in the evening after I finished my day. And I knew that many of my patients talked about how great it was and the friends they made and how important it was to them. But, I didn't really fully understand it. Again, I needed to listen in a different way or experience in a different way. One of the busiest weeks of my life was the week that I volunteered to be both the camp doctor who stayed on site for a week and the counselor for the youngest boys' cabin. And
just asking for it there, Doc.
I had no idea. And it was one of the most rewarding weeks of my life, and as well as one of the busiest. And I learned firsthand how these types of support services are absolutely necessary for children who are facing life-threatening illnesses, and not just the patients, their families. An even more powerful experience was sibling camp. So the brothers and sisters of these children going through cancer treatment, and the emotions that they had and didn't really have enough of an outlet for it. So I think that what your organization does, and other organizations like Camp Ooch or Campfire Circle now, Childhood Cancer Canada, so many other organizations are really the glue, the fabric that helps these patients and their families hold their very challenging, scary, and difficult lives together. And without that, I don't know how they would get through this and have any chance of being intact. So thank you all for what you do and what you bring to the table for those patients and their families.
Well, I want to end our podcast by thanking you. Thank you for having the open mind to continue learning and hearing and understanding and creating such incredible policy. And I think that, one of the things we said that we look for is how can the everyman take something away from these incredible experiences and situations that doctors and patients often find themselves in, even though they might not ever be in those situations. And I think hearing from you, it's a breath of fresh air to understand continuing education, continuing learning, perhaps in a way that a doctor wouldn't think is the way that they might need to continue learning. And having that open mind really sounds incredible, and the impact that you've been able to make. So thank you for that. And thank you very much for your time, as we know how busy you are. And we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Very, very insightful, and definitely one of the best ones we've had so far.
It's been a privilege to speak with you.
Thank you. And I look forward to perhaps being in touch and connecting outside of the podcast, and we can discuss perhaps different ways that we might be able to collaborate. So thank you for that.
That sounds great. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Whitlock, for joining us today and sharing with us all the up-and-coming research that you and the rest of pediatric cancer community is doing right now. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it really touched on a lot of different aspects of how cancer is being looked at today, how the hospital is including families into the care plan, bringing nurses into the conversation as they're the ones that are spending the most time with the patients and the families and getting the full story and understanding of what's really going on. Discussing the CPCC, which is absolutely incredible, $23 million to the consortium. It's going to do a lot of amazing work. There's so much in this conversation to unpack that, just listening to it once probably won't be enough for everybody. So please listen to it again, take it all in, because what was discussed in this conversation really was a lot of groundbreaking information that will be coming out soon. I hope you guys all enjoyed it. Thank you again, Dr. Whitlock, and thank you to the listeners for choosing to listen to us today. On Air with High is a High Lifeline Canada project, produced by myself, Bryan Strasberg, hosted by myself and the Executive Director of High Lifeline Canada, Mordechai Rothman. Guests are booked by Orly Davis, and graphic design is done by Candace Alper. On Air with High is edited by myself, and the music is provided by Music Unlimited at pixabay.com. To learn more about High Lifeline and how you can help us, please visit our website at highlifelinecanada.org. Don't forget to subscribe and give us that 5-star rating, and of course, share it with all your friends. Thank you for choosing to listen to On Air with High and supporting our cause. Being a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support from our community to help keep our programs running and allow us to continually service our families while offering incredible experiences
such as family vacations after treatments, trips to Edmonton Mall, home-cooked meals, big sibling programs, day camp and sleepover camp, and many, many more. If you enjoy our stories and you're thinking of making a charitable donation, think of Chai Lifeline Canada and the children you would be supporting. You can visit us at ChaiLifelineCanada.org.